In March 2026, something extraordinary happened in the world of quantum computing that sent shockwaves through the technology industry, particularly among engineers and executives at ASML, the Dutch semiconductor equipment manufacturer. Google's Quant AI team published research that fundamentally changed how we need to think about the security of our digital world. This wasn't just another incremental step forward in quantum research. This was a watershed moment that compressed what experts thought would be decades of safety into what might now be less than a decade. Google demonstrated a refined version of Shor's algorithm that requires 20 times fewer resources to crack the elliptic curve cryptography that secures Bitcoin, Ethereum, and essentially every financial transaction made online today. Think about that for a moment. The mathematical foundation that protects your bank accounts, your cryptocurrency holdings, your government secrets, and your most sensitive business communications suddenly became 20 times more vulnerable overnight. This breakthrough didn't happen in isolation either. It came alongside the successful deployment of Google's Willow processor, a 105-qubit superconducting chip that achieves something the quantum computing field has been chasing for 30 years, proof that you can build a perfect computer out of imperfect parts. For decades, quantum researchers faced an impossible wall. The fundamental problem was this: quantum computers are extraordinarily sensitive machines. Qubits, the quantum bits that form the building blocks of quantum processors, are susceptible to even the tiniest disturbances. A slight vibration, a stray photon, the slightest thermal fluctuation can cause what's called decoherence, which essentially destroys the quantum state and ruins your computation. The cruel irony was that the more qubits you added to try to make your computer more powerful, the more noise and errors you introduced. It was like trying to dry a floor with a wet mop. Every additional mop stroke just made the floor wetter. Researchers called this barrier the 30-year wall, and many thought it might be insurmountable. Google's Willow chip finally broke through. The team proved something that seemed theoretically impossible. By increasing the number of physical qubits in their surface code architecture, they could actually decrease the overall error rate. This wasn't a marginal improvement. This was the eureka moment for quantum computing. They moved the system below threshold, meaning they've crossed from the regime where more qubits mean more problems into the regime where more qubits mean fewer problems. They started with a 303 grid of qubits and scaled up to a 7-7 grid, and the errors went down, not up. This single achievement transformed quantum computing from perpetual potential into practical engineering reality. But here's where it gets truly concerning for the industry, and particularly for companies like ASML. The implications of this breakthrough extend far beyond the research labs. When you combine Google's progress on error correction with their simultaneous advances in algorithmic efficiency, you get a timeline that nobody in the technology industry expected to arrive so quickly. The mathematical problem that quantum computers solve, factoring large numbers and solving discrete logarithm problems, directly threatens the security of every asymmetric cryptographic system in use today. RSA encryption, elliptic curve cryptography, but these aren't niche technologies. They're embedded in absolutely everything. They protect your emails, your financial transactions, your government communications, your medical records, and essentially every piece of sensitive data that moves across the internet. In early 2026, adversaries started something called Harvest, now decrypt later attacks. They're not waiting for quantum computers to become available to attack your systems. Instead, they're harvesting encrypted data right now, your financial records, your trade, secrets, your classified communications. They're storing this data in vast databases, betting that within 5 to 15 years, when quantum computers become powerful enough, they'll be able to break the encryption retroactively and see everything. Google confirmed that these attacks are already happening. Threat actors are actively collecting encrypted traffic from financial systems, from supply chains, from defense, contractors. They understand that data has a shelf life. Your banking information needs to stay private for decades. Trade secrets need to stay confidential, potentially forever. A classified government document might need to remain secret for 50 years or more. If a quantum computer breaks the encryption within that time frame, everything is exposed. This is where ASML becomes deeply worried, though you won't necessarily see them publishing worried statements. ASML is the world's only supplier of extreme ultraviolet, or EUV, lithography machines. These are the most technologically sophisticated manufacturing tools ever created by humanity. They cost hundreds of millions of dollars each. They're so complex that ASML is literally the only company in the world capable of building them. These machines are essential for manufacturing the most advanced semiconductor chips on the planet. Every cutting-edge chip that goes into artificial intelligence systems, every processor in modern data centers, every component in advanced military systems relies on ASML's technology. Without ASML's EUV lithography systems, the semiconductor industry would grind to a halt. Now, ASML's concern isn't direct. It's not that quantum computers will replace their manufacturing processes or make EUV lithography obsolete. That's not what's happening. Instead, the threat is more insidious and touches on every aspect of their business operations. First, consider the cryptographic vulnerability in ASML's supply chain. ASML manufactures equipment for companies like TSMC, Samsung, Intel, and SK Hynix. These relationships involve enormous amounts of sensitive data, trade secrets about manufacturing processes, pricing information, contract terms, technical specifications, delivery schedules. All of this is protected by encryption. The problem is that this data often has a very long shelf life. A contract between ASML and TSMC might be confidential for 10 or 20 years. If adversaries are harvesting encrypted communications today, and if quantum computers become powerful enough in that time frame, they could retroactively decrypt years of business secrets. Consider the additional complexity. ASML's supply chain is global and intricate. Suppliers all around the world send encrypted communications about components, manufacturing specifications, delivery schedules, and pricing. These communications are encrypted with the assumption that the encryption will hold for the duration of the contract. But if that assumption breaks down because of quantum computing advances, suddenly every competitor, every adversary, every nation-state actor has access to years of your most sensitive business information. This creates vulnerability at multiple levels. It's not just ASML itself. It's every supplier, every customer, every contractor in the entire ecosystem. Then there's the mathematical reality that ASML's engineers understand all too well. To build the quantum computers that will eventually threaten encryption, you need incredibly sophisticated silicon technology. A quantum computer that can break RSA 2048 encryption requires approximately 1 million physical qubits. That's the raw material. But because of error correction overhead, you actually need about 20 times that many physical qubits to create the logical qubits that can run useful algorithms. This means you're looking at tens of millions of qubits in a practical system. The only way to scale quantum computing to those levels is through advanced semiconductor manufacturing. IBM is using superconducting qubits that require precision fabrication at submicron scales. Google is exploring neutral atom systems, which also require advanced chip fabrication for control electronics. Microsoft is developing topological qubits that require even more sophisticated semiconductor technology. The irony is almost painful for ASML to contemplate. The company whose technology enables the manufacturing of quantum computers is also the company most vulnerable to the security threats posed by those same quantum computers. ASML's success in pushing Moore's law forward in enabling companies to manufacture ever smaller, more sophisticated chips is directly accelerating the timeline for quantum computers capable of breaking encryption. The more advanced ASML's technology becomes, the faster quantum computing advances. The faster quantum computing advances, the sooner the encryption protecting ASML's business becomes worthless. In May 2026, quantum experts were shocked by announcements from both IBM and Google about a convergence in their technical approaches. This wasn't just Google making progress. IBM released their Condor processor with 1-to-100-121 qubits and outlined a roadmap toward their Flamingo and Kookaburra architectures. Both companies achieved a major milestone simultaneously. They reduced the ratio of physical qubits required per logical qubit from a previously necessary 1,000-to-1 ratio down to just 100-to-1. This doesn't sound like much if you're not paying close attention, but it's staggering. It means the timeline for reaching cryptographically relevant quantum computers just got accelerated by years or possibly decades. IBM's strategy focused on scale-out, adding more qubits to a system by using modular interconnects and couplers that allow qubits on separate chips to become entangled. Google's approach focused on precision, proving that error correction actually works, and that the error rates decrease as you scale up. Both approaches are converging toward the same goal: millions of qubits in a fault-tolerant system. Both approaches relied on artificial intelligence to accelerate the development. AI systems are now being used to calibrate the pulse sequences of quantum processors in real time, predicting noise before it happens and adjusting the system automatically. This is no longer theoretical research. This is engineering at scale. The security implications became even more concrete in April 2026 when researchers published detailed analysis of what cryptographic attacks would look like once quantum computers reached sufficient capability. They identified two high-risk scenarios. The first involves funds stored in dormant legacy addresses where the public key is already visible on the blockchain. About 6.9 million Bitcoin, roughly 32% of the entire Bitcoin supply, exists in addresses where the public key is exposed. The second scenario involves active transactions currently in flight. When you spend Bitcoin or Ethereum, your public key becomes visible in the transaction for a brief window. If a sufficiently powerful quantum computer existed, an attacker could potentially intercept that transaction in flight. and create a competing transaction that spends the same funds to a different address. Ethereum researcher Justin Drake described these publications as monumental developments for quantum computing and cryptography. He cautioned that timelines for practical attacks remain probabilistic, but he estimated there is now a meaningful chance that a quantum computer could break elliptic curve keys by the early 2030s. Some systems could theoretically crack keys in minutes. Others might take days. The complexity comes from the differences between quantum hardware architectures and the trade-offs between speed and qubit efficiency. A neutral atom system might run slowly but scale to very high qubit counts. A superconducting system might run quickly but struggle to scale to the necessary size. Either way, the early 2030s represents a fundamentally different timeline than the 2035 deadline that NIST originally specified. Google's response was to announce that they would secure all of their own systems against quantum computers by 2029. Think about that. Google, with all of their resources and expertise, believes they can conduct a complete migration away from vulnerable cryptography within 3 years. That's an extraordinarily aggressive timeline, and it signals how seriously they take the threat. If Google thinks they need to act that urgently, why should anyone else be less concerned? Cloudflare, which secures a significant fraction of the internet's traffic, announced that it was accelerating its own deadline to prepare for quantum computers to 2029 as well. These aren't fringe voices. These are companies that understand the internet's infrastructure better than almost anyone. The mathematical foundation of the threat is inevitable and well understood. Shor's algorithm, discovered in 1994, provides a quantum polynomial time solution to integer factorization and discrete logarithm problems. These are exactly the mathematical problems that RSA, classical Diffie-Hellman, and elliptic curve cryptography reduce to. Cryptographically relevant quantum computer of sufficient scale breaks all three. The mathematics is not going to change. Quantum computers will eventually become powerful enough to run Shor's algorithm effectively. The only variables are how long it takes and how much effort is required. Both of those variables have shifted dramatically in the direction of threat because of the breakthroughs in 2026. ASML engineers and executives are deeply aware of another concerning development: the geopolitical concentration of materials required for quantum computing. Google's Willow chip uses indium for the connectors between wafers. IBM's superconducting quantum processors use niobium for their Josephson junctions. Microsoft's topological qubit prototype uses indium arsenide and indium phosphate. These materials aren't rare earth elements in the traditional sense, but they're strategically critical. Niobium is used in tiny quantities globally, but there's no practical substitute that doesn't come with severe performance trade-offs. Chinese firms have quietly acquired significant ownership stakes in the Brazilian and Indonesian operations that dominate global niobium supply. This creates a strategic vulnerability. The country that controls the supply chain for quantum computing materials might also be the country least interested in deploying post-quantum cryptography throughout its systems. For a company like ASML, this creates additional vulnerability. If geopolitical tensions rise and access to critical materials becomes restricted or weaponized, quantum computing development could accelerate in hostile nations while being constrained in allied nations. This creates an asymmetric security risk. A nation-state actor could be harvesting encrypted communications from allied countries today, banking on the fact that they'll have quantum computers capable of decryption before those same allied countries implement post-quantum cryptography defenses. The immediate threat, though, isn't about quantum computers being used for offensive cyber attacks. The immediate threat is the harvest now, decrypt later scenario. Google confirmed that adversaries are actively harvesting encrypted financial records, trade secrets, and classified communications right now. They're collecting from everywhere, from diplomatic cables, from corporate communications, from military systems, from financial transactions. They're storing these in vast databases and waiting. The longer the delay between encryption and decryption capability, the more data they can harvest. But the narrower that window becomes, the more urgent the threat is for organizations that have data with multi-year or multi-decade confidentiality requirements. In February 2026, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, issued federal guidance identifying technology product categories where post-quantum cryptography is widely available. Government contracts are expected to mandate a PQC compliance starting in 2026 if your organization does business with the federal government, or if you're subject to frameworks like FedRAMP, CMMC, or ITAR. The writing is on the wall. You need to implement post-quantum cryptography, and you need to do it now. This creates a massive compliance burden. Every system that was built with the assumption that RSA or elliptic curve cryptography would be sufficient suddenly needs to be retrofitted or replaced. The National Institute of Standards and Technology finalized its first set of post-quantum cryptographic standards in August 2024. These include ML-KEM for key exchange and ML-DSA for digital signatures. These algorithms have been carefully vetted and tested to withstand attacks from both classical and quantum computers. But here, as the practical problem, implementing these standards at scale across an entire organization is extraordinarily complex. Cryptography isn't just isolated in a few places. It's woven throughout every system. It's in APIs and protocols, in certificate authorities and key management systems, in hardware and software. Every component that uses cryptography needs to be updated or replaced. For ASML, this creates a different kind of threat. The company has to ensure that all of its own systems are quantum safe, but it also has to ensure that all of its customers can use their equipment safely in a post-quantum world. TSMC, Samsung, Intel, these are companies that manufacture chips that go into everything from smartphones to nuclear weapon systems. If their manufacturing infrastructure isn't cryptographically secure against quantum attacks, the implications cascade throughout the entire technology ecosystem. The supply chain becomes a vulnerability rather than an asset. Google's strategy of pursuing both superconducting and neutral atom modalities simultaneously creates additional pressure on the semiconductor industry. Neutral atom systems have already scaled to arrays of 10,000 qubits as of March 2026. These systems can be packed into dense 3D arrays and reconfigured on the fly. They represent a different path to scaled quantum computing than superconducting systems. Both paths rely on advanced semiconductor manufacturing. Both paths require components that only ASML can make. This dual approach suggests that Google believes that multiple technological pathways will lead to practical quantum computing, which means that even if one approach hits unexpected obstacles, others will continue advancing. This accelerates the overall timeline. The convergence of quantum progress and post-quantum cryptography deployment is where real urgency emerges. Organizations need to implement quantum-resistant cryptography before quantum computers become powerful enough to break their current encryption. But they need to do this while simultaneously maintaining compatibility with their existing systems and ensuring that the new cryptographic systems actually perform adequately under real-world conditions. Research published in 2026 showed that post-quantum cryptographic algorithms generally outperform classical algorithms under normal network conditions, which is good news. But it's only good news if those algorithms can be deployed widely and quickly. The window for deployment is probably measured in years now, not decades. ASML's concern extends to supply chain resilience as well. If adversaries are harvesting encrypted communications from suppliers, contractors, and customers, they're building detailed maps of the semiconductor supply chain. They understand which companies depend on which suppliers, what technologies are being used, how manufacturing is being distributed, geographically. This information could be weaponized to disrupt supply chains, to target specific technologies, or to conduct industrial espionage at scale. The semiconductor industry is already fragile and concentrated. Over 100 countries depend on Taiwan for advanced chip manufacturing. Europe has minimal manufacturing capacity. The United States is trying to rebuild its semiconductor ecosystem through enormous government investments. In this context, adding quantum computing threat vectors to the supply chain becomes an additional layer of vulnerability. In May 2026, Medium published analysis of what it called the quantum convergence. The article noted that both IBM and Google had officially shifted the industry from the era of noisy intermediate-scale quantum devices into the era of fault-tolerant quantum computing. The article described this as the moment when quantum computing moved from perpetual potential into engineering reality. More concerningly, it noted that the G7 nations adopted a quantum roadmap in early 2026 that explicitly recognized the timeline compression. The roadmap predicted that systems would reach the capacity to threaten legacy RSA 2048 encryption by 2028. Not 2035, not 2040, 2028. That's just 2 years away from when this narration is being written. The implications for ASML are complex and multifaceted. On one hand, ASML benefits from quantum computing development. Quantum computers require advanced semiconductor manufacturing. The control electronics that manage quantum systems need to be built using the most sophisticated chip manufacturing techniques available. Quantum error correction requires sophisticated classical computers running alongside the quantum processors. All of this drives demand for advanced semiconductor manufacturing, which drives demand for ASML's EUV lithography systems. On the other hand, ASML faces enormous risks from cryptographic vulnerability. The company's supply chain, its intellectual property, its manufacturing processes, its business relationships, all of this is protected by encryption that could become worthless within years. The company has billions of dollars worth of intellectual property embedded in its EUV machines. This intellectual property is protected by patents, by trade secrets, by contractual relationships. If adversaries can break the encryption protecting these secrets, the company's competitive advantage could evaporate. Additionally, ASML's customers are the companies most vulnerable to quantum computing threats. TSMC manufactures chips that protect cryptocurrency holdings worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Samsung manufactures memory chips that store financial data. Intel manufactures processors that run government systems. If any of these companies' systems are compromised through quantum-enabled decryption of harvested encrypted communications, the entire technology ecosystem could experience a crisis of trust. Supply chains could be disrupted. Manufacturing could be interrupted. Geopolitical tensions could escalate. The financial sector has recognized the threat most acutely. G7 roadmaps adopted in early 2026 mandate post-quantum cryptography compliance by the end of 2030. That's 4 years to migrate an entire industry's cryptographic infrastructure. Financial institutions have to update trading systems, payment networks, custody systems, settlement systems. They have to update the cryptographic foundations of global finance. This is an unprecedented challenge, and it's being driven by the recognition that quantum computers capable of breaking encryption could exist within years, not decades. The government sector is moving even faster. The U.S. Department of Defense has classified quantum computing as a critical national security issue. The National Security Council has elevated quantum computing threat discussions to the highest level. Military communications, intelligence systems, weapons guidance systems, all of this relies on cryptography that could become vulnerable to quantum attacks within years. The U.S. government is investing heavily in post-quantum cryptography deployment and in quantum computing development simultaneously. It's a race, and everyone recognizes that the stakes could not be higher. For ASML, the path forward is complex. The company has to secure its own systems against quantum threats while maintaining the capability to support its customers in doing the same. It has to invest in research into quantum computing technologies while ensuring that those technologies don't become existential threats to the company's core business. It has to navigate geopolitical complexities around supply chain security and technology competition. And it has to do all of this while maintaining leadership in semiconductor manufacturing in an increasingly competitive global landscape. Google's breakthrough has compressed the timeline for everything. What seemed like a problem that wouldn't require urgent action until 2035 or 2040 is now a problem that demands immediate action in 2026. Organizations need to assess their cryptographic dependencies, identify which data needs to remain confidential for decades, and begin planning migration strategies to quantum-resistant cryptography. For supply chain companies like ASML, the challenge is even more complex because they have to simultaneously manage their own security vulnerabilities while helping their customers navigate the same challenges. The quantum breakthrough of 2026 represents a fundamental inflection point in technology. We've moved from a world where quantum computing was a theoretical threat to a world where it's an engineering reality with concrete timelines. We've moved from treating post-quantum cryptography as a nice-to-have to treating it as an urgent business requirement. And we've created a new strategic vulnerability where countries and companies that move quickly to deploy quantum-resistant cryptography will be secure, while those that delay will face increasing risk of their encrypted communications being decrypted retroactively. ASML, as the linchpin of the global semiconductor manufacturing ecosystem, sits at the center of all of these dynamics. The company's engineers understand that they're building the tools that will enable the quantum computers that threaten their own security. It's a paradox that encapsulates the broader challenges facing the technology industry in 2026 and beyond. The only path forward is rapid, aggressive deployment of quantum-resistant cryptography, continued investment in quantum computing research and development, careful management of supply chain vulnerabilities, and international cooperation on standards and security practices. The alternative is a world where harvested encrypted data from the present era suddenly becomes readable in the near future, with incalculable consequences for security, privacy, and trust in digital systems worldwide.